Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this timely discussion on the rise of on-demand manufacturing and just-in-time inventory. I'd like to open by thanking our partner for this event, UBS, and our co-host, Jay Soul, UBS Retailing, Department Stores, and Specialty Softlines Analyst, and Michael Lasser, UBS Hardlines, Broadlines, and Food Retail Analyst. Thank you both for your continued partnership with Xrc Labs. I'm Halley Morrissey. I run business development at Xrc. For those of you who are newer to who we are, Xrc Labs is an innovation accelerator for the next generation of disruptors in the retail and consumer goods sectors. We run 2 programs each year that bring together entrepreneurs, investors, and corporate brands and retailers to foster rapid innovation in retail and CPG. We have 8 corporate partners, retailers like CVS and Lowe's, as well as service providers like MasterCard and Accenture. All of our corporate partners rely on us to be predictive, truthful, and connected. Predictive means access to early stage startups. Truthful means thought leadership, and connected means access not only to startups, but to peer corporate partners, trade, and Wall Street. We built Xrc Labs because the pace of innovation has outpaced the ability for corporate businesses to respond. Startups have the will and the enthusiasm to take outsized risks to achieve massive change and impact. They are willing to fail and learn quickly, and most importantly, learn from their customers directly. Despite the best efforts of corporate innovation initiatives over the last 10 years, the best products are still coming from startups. The Xrc ecosystem consists of investors, startups, and corporate partners who come together to accelerate innovation and disruption that the consumer is demanding. We fund each startup with a net $100K in exchange for preferred equity and participation rights in future rounds. Our team of 12 works tirelessly to help build these startups. As investors, you'll find we fund early stage companies across the retail and consumer goods landscape. Over the last 4 years, we've invested in 80 companies, from consumer brands to solutions in next-gen commerce, supply chain, on-demand manufacturing, e-com, and the consumerization of healthcare. Within the consumer goods sector, our breadth of investments is wide. These are just a taste of the consumer brands we invest in, from prebiotic waters to nootropics to superfood dog kibble and skincare for the gaming community. On the supply chain side, we've also invested across the board, from autonomous drones to labor optimization, spatial intelligence, and on-demand manufacturing. You can see a sample of the full breadth of our portfolio here. And our performance bears out the success of our focus and strategy. Since our start in the fall of 2015, our companies are performing better than better-known accelerators like Y Combinator on a cohort-by-cohort basis. Being focused and smaller has its benefits to our investor base. And finally, to continue to support the success of our accelerator startups, we've launched the Xrc Growth Fund. This fund focuses on backing the winners, providing additional capital and operational support as a startup achieves their next level of success. If either the Accelerator Fund or the Growth Fund is of interest to you, please contact Pano Anthos at pano@xrclabs.com. And please reach out to me, Halley Morrissey, if you'd like to learn more about our corporate relationships. Now I'd like to bring it back to Jay Soul and Michael Lasser at UBS. Jay will introduce today's topic. Jay, I pass it to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Halley. And good afternoon, everyone. First, on behalf of Michael and myself, I would just like to say thank you to Xrc for including us in this event. We're grateful and honored to be a part of it. We're really excited to get into the conversation here because on-demand manufacturing and just-in-time inventory is an issue that can determine who the winners will be in the apparel industry, in our view. Companies that can figure out on-demand manufacturing are going to have a major competitive advantage over their peers. The reason this is so important is on-demand manufacturing could unlock the potential for apparel companies to reach so many different goals. And I'll give 4 examples. First, and this is obvious, is higher gross margin. Companies that can better match supply with demand are going to have less excess inventory and better gross margins. Second, companies with faster supply chains will drive better revenue growth. Companies with fast speed to market will be able to introduce product newness more often and be more adept at capitalizing on fashion trends. And this increasingly isn't an option for brands, it's a must-do. As commerce continues to shift to digital channels, fashion cycles are coming and going quickly. Brands have to have lots of newness if they're going to stay relevant. Third, on-demand manufacturing will help companies maintain healthier brand images over the long term. For brands to stay relevant, they have to continually have new stories to tell and maintain an image of scarcity. The formula to do this is to deliver newness frequently, stay on trend, engage with consumers often, and maintain full price selling. All of this could be enabled by on-demand manufacturing. And lastly, companies with flexible supply chains are going to have a leg up managing risks. whether it's tariffs and trade, ESG issues, or even, and let's hope not, another pandemic. A more flexible supply chain will help mitigate these threats. The discussion today is going to give us a great read on the present state of on-demand manufacturing, as well as what the future may hold and how new technologies may impact it. So thank you again to Xrc. And with that, I'd like to pass it back to Halley to introduce the rest of our speakers today.
Thanks, Jay. I'm pleased to introduce the rest of our speakers. First, we have Kate Nadolny, SVP of Business Strategy and Innovation at PVH Corp. Also joining us, Cavano, CEO of 3D knitting company Nimbly. And lastly, we're joined by Aman Advani, CEO and co-founder of Ministry of Supply. Moderating today's session is Pano Anthos, founder and managing director of Xrc Labs. Before I pass it to Pano, I'd like to ask audience members to submit any questions you have through the Zoom Q&A function, and we'll ask them at the end of the session. Pano, I pass it to you to moderate the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Halley. So we've got a great panel here, and we really tried to put this panel together to provide a real contrast in the big, brand like a PVH and many brands, and then an emerging early stage brand like Ministry of Supply, and then a capabilities provider who is building out the technology and footprint to automate many of the things that Jay described in the on-demand manufacturing space. So that's the context by which we're going to have this conversation. It's going to be wide open, and we look forward to learning a lot. Plus, we'll provide time at the end for questions from the audience. So let's start with the brands. So Ministry and PVH, Kate and Aman. So tell us, we're dealing with a pandemic. We've got, I believe, a lot of inventory still sitting out there. Maybe you could give us an update. Did you have to cancel a lot of orders? Have you had to really adjust dramatically? Or is it business as usual? Kate?
Thanks, Pano, and thank you so much for inviting me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this great conversation. I think, for brands like PVH, it wouldn't be surprising to hear that obviously the change and the impact of COVID obviously meant that there was some inventory issues to be dealt with, in particular in Q1 and Q2. I think we've really seen a huge shift from in-store to online that we see continuing, even as stores continue to open back up. We are seeing that shift is something we think is going to continue. I think overall, the consumer has become more comfortable in digital, be it from a commercial perspective and a transactional perspective, like you're seeing it with brands like ours online, but even in a panel like this where something we would normally do in person is now digital. So as the consumer becomes more comfortable and finds that balance, I think that's really where we're seeing a lot of that movement happen. That said, that doesn't, take into account the many stores out there, our own, as well as all of our retail partners who have quite a bit of inventory right now that they're sitting on. So there's a lot of creative ways that we're thinking through it, but it absolutely kind of opens our eyes to how we have to work faster and we have to be able to be more reactive to things like this as they arise in the future.
And Aman, thank you, Kate. Aman, obviously you're a much smaller brand, but very successful. How has the pandemic really hit you on the whole question around inventory?
Yeah, I'm going to pin on to the end of Kate's answer there, but first and foremost, echo her gratitude for being here and for the other 100 or so people on the call. Thanks for having us. Jumping off of what Kate said, one of the things we've heard this period referred to a lot as is kind of the great accelerator. So rather than just a little vignette in time, it's actually just speeding up the curve that was naturally happening anyway. And I really like that point of view where it's not that you're doing anything that's kind of pandemic friendly or pandemic specific, but you're accelerating initiatives that might be more likely to succeed in a time like this. And so what that's meant for us is shifting away from a more traditional, let's say dress shirt, and towards a lot of the silhouettes that were fortunately already in the pipeline that are more suitable from a clothing standpoint to what you might wear in the middle of a pandemic, whether it's something as obvious as masks or something a little bit more subtle like what you might wear, below the Zoom, right? So pants that are pull-on friendly rather than needing a belt. As a small example of the type of product that we just threw into our accelerator and said instead of a 2-year timeline to bring something like that to market for our engineering, research, and testing modules, let's accelerate that and make it happen in 6 months. Let's get it out by holiday. And with the help of folks like Kurt and his team at Nimbly, we were able to turn our supply chain in many cases from 6 to 24 months down to 3 to 6 weeks in certain cases, from concept to doorstep. So that acceleration has allowed a lot more agility on the supply and as such on the demand side. And we've been grateful to have partners who embrace that agility as well.
I really like that ring, concept to doorstep. So maybe you can give for the audience, and I should have done this earlier, my apologies, just kind of the scope of your brand if they don't know it. How many SKUs do you carry? What's the mix look like? Just so we can have a little context as we get. Everyone knows PVH, but, and so Kate, I won't bore you with asking you to do that, but maybe Aman, you could take just a minute and describe the brand.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. So we are a clothing brand based here in Boston. We've been up and running for about 8 years. As a founding team, we met at MIT, in which I share only to accentuate the fact that we're engineering when it comes to fashion. So everything you love about your favorite gym clothes built into the silhouettes that are not necessarily gym clothes, although we do now make gym clothes as well. So full line of men's and women's clothing, tops, bottoms, outerwear, everything in between. All premised on this idea of using science to make the product better. So we simulate years of use in our labs, and we bring it to market only when it's passed those tests. And we're able to make clothing that is otherworldly comfortable through the use of this scientific process that we've employed. So about 100 to 150 SKUs. Again, we stay as traditional and kind of close to the center as possible when it comes to the fashion side. So a lot of blues and grays. But where we really try to blow people away is in the function, breathability, softness, machine washability, ditch the iron, dry cleaner, really kind of stuff that you look forward to wearing rather than dreading. So yeah, hopefully that's a little bit of a context as to why we had to pivot, and that a lot of what we were making, like PVH, was office friendly, right? And with offices closed, you can imagine that a pivot was necessary to recover that part of our business that was at risk.
Very cool. Thank you. So Kurt, hey, he mentioned you. So, Aman mentioned you, and I think it might be good just to give the audience just a really brief overview of what you're working on, and then we can get your perspective on the same topic.
So Nimbly is focused on building out the technology and the network, if you will, to enable on-demand manufacturing. We're starting in the knit area in particular, because knits, unlike cut and sew products, are very much driven by technology. It's a computerized knitting machine, either whole garment or fully fashioned. And it's driven by a computer program. So theoretically, the computer program that runs in one place can run in lots of different places. And what we're doing in Nimbly is building out the technology that connects all these machines together globally, so that you can then take a layer of AI over top of it and say, hey, what's the optimal way to produce this? Do I make some close? Do I make them all close? Do I make samples close and then make some more a little bit further away, and then make some stuff way far away? And how do you bring that together to optimize, not for the lowest price, but to optimize for the fact that you don't want any waste and you want to have the least impact in your supply chain from an environmental point of view. And you want to sell every piece that you make and service every customer that wants a piece. And that's a very different kind of way of thinking about the apparel supply chain as it has been done for the last 50 years or so.
So thank you, Kurt. What I wanted to ask both brands is, okay, so we got COVID and a pandemic and stores are closed, but is that really the only impact? My sense also is that the apparel industry as a business, in terms of non-essentials, and that term is being used a lot right now, is not nearly as critical, and therefore is being more optional, is therefore seeing lower demand because of all those capacities. And therefore, if that's the case, Kate, how are you responding to the fact that people just don't need as many t-shirts?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think what you kind of touched on was certain things are required or essentials versus certain things are obviously nice to haves, right? And apparel in many cases is a nice to have in a time like COVID. But I would say we actually saw some specific categories in our business really jump up. We saw people kind of getting back to essentials. We saw people buy a lot of underwear. sitting at home. So that's something that I think, it's about understanding the trend and the shift and understanding, again, how much of that is going to be a today thing versus how much is going to be a long-term thing. So I think that those shifts and how we plan for those shifts in the future is really critical. One of the key things I think in all of this, and really we can't have a strong supply chain and have a strong perspective on how we're going to manufacture goods unless we really have great planning and forecasting. And I would say, we've been on that journey pre-COVID. We were understanding pre-COVID that we needed to continue to improve there and do more and be smarter when it comes to planning our business and understanding our consumer and really making sure that we're making the product our consumer wants. But as Aman said, COVID really was an accelerant. It wasn't necessarily a shift in trend. So it accelerated our need to really understand that consumer and understand minute by minute what they're looking for, what's important, what's driving that intent, and how we can then utilize that to make better decisions when it comes to our assortment and when it comes to how we decide to manufacture, price, promote, and distribute our goods.
Aman, maybe you want to weigh in on that before I jump to the next kind of adjacent question.
No, I think that's right. I will only add that we saw a great report come out from Deloitte on this idea of a K-shaped recovery. And I really liked this idea of thinking of the entire pandemic as causing kind of a K-shaped impact. And I think Kate really nailed it there by saying there's certain categories that are just exploding right now and others that are suffering. And that might invert in 6 months when we start to see kind of full recovery. But I do think keeping that context in mind is that we talk a lot in averages of those two kind of K bars being just above better. But I do think it's important to call out the disparity between those kind of K rising bar and then the falling one as category specific.
But couldn't we just slough all this off as, oh, it's a pandemic, it's going to pass, and we're going to get back to days of yore? Aman, I'll start with you first.
I don't think so. It comes back to what I mentioned earlier about this idea of the great accelerator, right? If we believe that to be true, then a lot of this is here to stay, even if just an influence and not necessarily in its current manifestation. But as a small example, as it relates to us and our business, is the casualization of the wear-to-work wardrobe has been brewing for years, right? The entire world found out all at once that they're a lot more productive when they can be in clothes that are comfortable, when they're not constrained by super stiff fabrics, belts, tucked in shirts, shoes that don't breathe, that they could get a lot more done. And with that realization, there's no going back. There's still a need to be kind of presentable in public. And as public becomes a thing again, we'll see a reversion to a little bit. But I don't think people are ever going to go back to the feeling of just kind of constant dread of their wardrobe, where they dread going to the dry cleaners. They dread kind of hacking a local hotel iron. We think this was a huge opportunity for us and for any progressive thinking company to seize what we've always known, which is that people are better when they're comfortable, and that's here to stay. And people learn that lesson in the best possible way as a silver lining of all this, all at once. So we think stuff like, we're making a really beautiful pair of pull-on dress pants, which sounds wild. We think that kind of thing is here to stay, and that if a shirt is untucked, no one knows if you're wearing a belt or not. It doesn't matter. You may as well have a nice, cushy, soft waistband that goes with it. We think a lot of this is here to stay. Again, even if only an influence and not in its current manifestation, we'll see a lot of this going forward.
So you're saying basically short iron manufacturers and dry cleaners in so many words. I mean, I'm kind of joking a bit. Kate, did you want to weigh in? I mean, is this really are we expecting a snapback? Are you really changing everything forever in the way you look at this, not just your inventory management, but your merchandising as well? Or are we going back to, thank God this is over, let's get back to normal?
Yeah, I think I agree with Aman, and I would echo what he's saying about people understanding the value of comfort since they've been sort of given a taste of it on a regular basis in their work lives. But I'd say more so there's a pendulum swing, right? So I think people went very far to being able to wear sweatpants every day and, being able to wear super comfort. And I think that unstructured nature, is going to be more prevalent than maybe it has been. But I think there might be a gradual sort of swing back to the middle where, like Aman was saying, it's still going to be a dress pant, but it's going to be a more comfortable dress pant. You still have to look nice, but the fabric, the functionality, the finishing, the attribution is going to be different. there are certain things that are going to shift, I think, more broadly. For example, we're seeing the market in men shift in fleece, right? So people who were wearing structured sweaters in holiday and past are, now starting to vote towards buying fleece and buying hoodies, and those sort of silhouettes, I think, are going to, continue to be more prevalent than they have been. But I do think that there's still going to be some details and some things there that are going to start to move back towards that, elevated, sharper look than maybe we've seen, all kind of sitting at home for the last 6 to 8 months.
So we're going to have hoodies at Christmas? I mean, is that what it's coming to? Hoodies at Christmas?
I would say that the total market trend is moving more towards sweatshirts than it is sweaters. So things like that, I think, kind of showcase where the market's moving, where the consumer's voting. And I think, again, does it mean that shift's going to last forever? No, but is it going to be more prevalent, at least to a degree? Absolutely.
We can also use this opportunity to talk about climate change and wearing T-shirts on Christmas soon. But yeah. I will I'll peg off of something Kate said there that I think is an important piece, and that's kind of acknowledging that this is all us guessing, and being kind of very clear that this is all just complete guesses, and that in so many ways our guesses aren't any more qualified than anyone else's. But what I will say to that end, and it's a compliment to Kurt's mission, is the best thing we can do is plan for the unknown and build a supply chain, build a messaging chain, build an entire value chain that allows for anything to come out of this. Because if there's one thing we've learned over the 6 months of fighting this, it's that we have no idea what's coming, and we can continue to guess. But as long as we build agility into all of our processes, especially into the product that we create, we're much better off and quicker to respond. So what we're building right now, as much as we are building new product, we're building new processes to allow us to adjust to whatever's next.
So that the only real constant then is change. Is that a right way to think about it? I mean, and that the customer is essentially, I wouldn't say irrational, but unpredictable. Is that also
Yeah,
true?
no, and in fact, I'd say very rational, but extremely unpredictable because of that. They're rationally reacting to a set of very unpredictable circumstances. And so in that way, we've spent so much time rebuilding our entire build-to-order supply chain, rebuilding our entire development process, rebuilding how we think of inventory. It used to be that once it was in the warehouse, that was it. We've taken things out of the warehouse and back into production to edit them into more applicable styles, stuff that we had never done in the 8 years of doing it.
So style really kind of form follows function. A cable knit sweater doesn't hold up to a hoodie just simply on the basis of comfort. We're never going to have style in that respect. And I'm going to move on, but I'm curious about how we view the notion of style and the arbitration of style. Is that really, ancient history, Kate?
Not at all. I think, an indication we haven't seen here in the US, but we've seen is in China. I think there's been a lot of talk about revenge shopping, right, in the Chinese market, where coming out of lockdown, coming out of COVID, a lot of more high-end and luxury shoppers were actually out and buying expensive bags, expensive, outerwear, things that they hadn't been buying before because it was new, right? So just as everything's cyclical, while I think we're overall going to see a move to comfort, I think in terms of style and look, that doesn't really change how the consumer views, what's on the runway, what's coming next, what's going to cyclically change as we think about fashion and trend.
Okay. So the only constant is change. Customers are rational, but unpredictable. So Kurt, in this world, what level of elasticity are you trying to build into this manufacturing process? How quickly can you turn when Aman calls you and says, change, what does that look like in terms of, kind of the reverberation of that through the supply chain? What are we collapsing here from going from what to what?
Well, when you look at the traditional retail model, this whole trilogy of inventory, sales, and working capital, people were let's load up on inventory and sell it and have this really long supply chain. And what we had with COVID is that just absolutely broke. And now everybody realizes that model that we've been doing for so long is just totally broken. And we need to go to something that's more elastic. But the supply chain can't be infinitely elastic. You have to stage stuff at some stage in the process. So we believe you look at, for each garment, what are the vital pieces and where do you stage them? So, for example, in knitwear, You need a program that has to be written to do that. And then you need the yarn, which is infinitely important for knitwear, is the supply of the yarn and what color and that kind of stuff. So if you can stage your yarns, which by the way is a lot cheaper than staging finished goods, then you can produce things very, very quickly. You can change colors very quickly. You can change styles very quickly. And what we're looking at is a supply chain that can have very quick reaction around weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and be able to change things, and then be able to get to quantities in 6 or 8 weeks that are huge quantities. I mean, we saw this with the work that we're doing for Aman, for his company, on the masks. We were manufacturing those masks where we could sample daily and test them right on our home machine, do small quantities in LA, and then do huge quantities in Sri Lanka, and pull that all together so you can have stuff delivered almost daily or weekly, and at the most a few weeks from far away. And so we're trying to build in that elasticity, but you really need to start thinking about how do you plan that supply chain. You can't execute if you don't plan it and have stuff pre-positioned to be able to execute that. And if you look like at retailers like Zara, that's how they do it, which is they have pre-positioned greige or yarn so that they can get that demand and make it, and in 15, 30 days have new stuff on the shelves.
So we're talking about 15 to 30 days is the goal, or do you think it's going to shrink even further from that, or even more?
I think it can shrink even more when you start to look at direct-to-consumer stuff. I mean, for Ministry, we're doing stuff now where the order comes out of the back of their online shopping system. It comes to us. We knit it that night and ship it to the customer the next day. That's about as quick as you can do it. And so within 48 hours, we're delivering product. And so we think it can get really, really quick as you start doing that, especially on the direct-to-consumer stuff. And that's what the consumer expects. They want it fast. And then you can morph designs, and you can have a whole continuum of designs that you're presenting to that consumer as you start to see demand. And if you start to see a product that's got really huge demand, then you shift that manufacturing to a more, let's make 100 of them, or let's make 1,000 of them, or even more. And then that takes a little bit longer, but you can still get to that immediate demand within 48 hours.
Thanks. So Kate, I want to ask you a question, and it's kind of a, transparent question here, which is that, there's a theory that, all right, sustainability is part of the story, right? We will have less waste because we'll match supply and demand more closely. But if we move much more closely to demand, isn't that going to essentially reduce the overall size of the apparel market further? I mean, we have a lot of stuff that's being sold by the Rosses, TJXs, and discounters. Is that just the future where we're just going to have less going to them, but then that's a smaller market overall?
Thanks, Pano. I wouldn't say that's the case, right? The market exists not just as a way for us to be liquidating goods as larger brands, but because there's a real consumer demand there. The consumer likes the experience. You mentioned, some of the Rosses and the TJXs of the world. They have a great treasure hunt experience, and the consumer loves that. And that isn't necessarily always about price. It's often just about a find. So I think how we manage and forecast that model will be different, but it may shrink, but I can't imagine that it would be meaningfully different when we think about how the consumer looks at different channels and different ways of operating based on what they're trying to get, not just from a product product offering, but an experience offering as well. I think what we'll also start to see as brands and consumers become more sustainable is other ways of sort of building new models are going to start to pop up, right? So resale, which is something that used to just be, your vintage clothing store down the street, is becoming digitized. It's, you think about how big ThredUp has become in the past few years. You think about how big all these platforms have become. I think some of these resale opportunities are going to also start to take some of, that space. And the consumer is going to start to say, hey, I want that same sort of, value proposition, or I want, something interesting and different. I'm going to do it from a vintage or a resale perspective versus doing it just straight from going to, a bargain hunt in the off-price channel. But, that said, again, there's there's a reason these businesses are so incredibly successful. And it's not just because, we're their customers and we're their clients, but because their consumers want to be, engaging with that type of experience.
So Jay said earlier, Kate, that if we sell less, we should be able to sell at higher margin. Do you support that? And do you think that's going to get reflected in I'm not specifically to PVH, but just to the apparel industry in general, that margins are going to improve, even though the quantities will be lower if we move this to an on-demand model more and more?
In a silo, yes. So if you were to say all else holding the same, we can now, be able to make things closer to demand signal and we can start to be tighter, yes. However, I think what starts to happen is the model starts to be able to include other things in it, right? So, more sustainable fibers are something that all brands are looking at because the consumer is asking for it. Those aren't today necessarily, the same price or cheaper than what we see out there in the market that we're currently using. So as we start to try to meet that consumer demand, potentially it's, hey, we can be smarter and save margins in terms of our planning process, but we might want to reinvest that into other benefits that the consumer is looking for that they're not necessarily paying more for.
So Aman, thanks. Let's talk a little bit on the sustainability side and what we call transparency through the supply chain, understanding where things are made, how they're made, that which is a value, and then the sustainability story, which is really around, less waste, therefore less landfill, and ideally less climate change. Walk us through kind of your thesis on that for ministry.
Yeah, I'll tie it to that last question a little bit and say, look, margins and the growth of margins are synonymous with value to the customer, right? Margins are a direct replication of what the customer values. A high margin product is not some marketing trickery. It's that there's value created in the process between raw materials and customer use. And so I don't think they're correlated. Margins and quantity should be correlated at all. Margins should be correlated only with quality. And fewer products may mean better products, but it may mean worse. And so I do think we need to keep our eye on the ball as an industry and make sure that we were making better product, and better can mean a lot of things. One of which is absolutely sustainability if the customer demands it. And so with that in mind, if we think of the entire life cycle as the footprint of the garment, which it should, right? The carbon calculations should never end upon shipping a product. They should end when the product is in its grave. Then customers are willing to pay for the value of a reduced or neutral footprint. That becomes part of that margin structure and part of that value creation. And that's exactly how we think of sustainability. It's a feature. Our garments are all super soft and stretchy, breathable, machine washable, and carbon neutral. And it is one of the features in that bulleted list. And the customer that values that is willing to pay for that. And that's what margins, I'm stating the obvious here, but I'm linking the conversations because I think when they become unlinked, sustainability feels like charity. And in that world, it may cease to exist or survive in the way that it needs to do its job. And so we've built sustainability into every ounce of the entire value chain so that we can prove it's not just a matter of hearsay. My partner Gihan just joined the board of Climate Neutral, who I encourage everybody to get to know, and is helping companies think through the process of becoming carbon neutral and then certify that they did so. And their playbook and now ours is very simple. It's measure, reduce, offset. And we can find those big offenders in our value chain where there's an opportunity for reduction. Overproduction being a huge one of them, Nimbly helping us out a lot there. Virgin materials being a large one. Using at this point, nearly a majority of our materials are now recycled. Each of these areas in your supply chain, if you can attack systematically and again, measure, reduce, offset, we finished that cycle off with a big investment in solar energy to fund clean energy and offset the remaining footprint. That becomes a really important feature to a customer if we can tell that story properly, and it is reflected in margins and it's self-sustaining. So we think the two questions are quite linked and important to go quite in depth on, both from our standpoint, but also a customer to ask those questions.
So Kate and Aman, when are we going to get a carbon score that you all will produce for your garments? Do you think that's going to happen? And as soon as carbon or longer? Yeah.
As soon as you ask for it. I love this question because I think that I think there's a presumption that it will automatically kind of just start to come to life, and that someone will create kind of the Yelp of carbon, and maybe that'll happen, that will kind of expose the big offenders, right? Which I'm all in favor of. I think it would be fantastic if there's a lot more transparency on those footprints. But the only thing that will actually spark that to becoming important is you, the customer, demanding it, emailing your favorite brands and asking them. And if they haven't, asking them why not, right? And pressuring companies to be really forthcoming with this information is the only thing that will create that change. And if they don't have an answer, there's two options. You can continue to ask them, or you can leave. And I think voting with your wallet is critically important. When you don't get an answer you like, put your money to where you do like it, right? Put your money to companies that align with your brand values. And I think if a lot more people voted with their wallet, when it comes to topics like this, I think we'd all be better off. And I suspect most.
Hey, how do you think about this? SPVH think about it on the front of a carbon score, or some way to quantify your efforts?
Yeah, I think any sort of tracking, traceability, ability to measure is coming. I think Aman's completely right. It's when the consumer asks for it, but I think it's also when the market asks for it, right? So I think we all probably saw the announcement by Amazon recently that they're looking to actually score and certify, based on their own sort of parameters, what product is sustainable on their site. And so that, I think, obviously, as somebody who we work with them, that lights a fire under us to say, hey, are we going to get there? Can we get there? What do we need to do to get there? How do we become, Amazon certified in sustainability? Which, that's kind of a good start, right? So our partners are starting to pressure us. Our consumers are starting to pressure us. And I think that really is what's going to be moving the needle versus, self-selection to do it. Despite the fact, I can say quite candidly, we very much have self-selected as well. We're part of a lot of different efforts globally to be able to move towards a more sustainable model. We've made a lot of commitments that we absolutely hold true in how we think about building our business. But in terms of timing, priority, and how we actually stage it, a lot of it's going to be based on, what's a priority to the consumer and to the marketplace.
I appreciate that. So with a few minutes we've got left, I want to kind of bring it to the future but present, which is, for all three of you, what is missing technologically or market-driven, kind of need that keeps us from moving more quickly into on-demand? There's all these benefits. We've heard them, you've described them, but we don't do it yet at scale. What's holding us back? Any of you and all of you.
Pano, I would say that the biggest challenge to this, there's a technology challenge, absolutely, and we're working on some of those things. But it's also a behavioral challenge. If you look at the way that a traditional retailer, how they're compensated, it's all the whole sourcing teams are compensated on IMU, which is how do I get the initial markup as high as possible, which means sourcing for the cheap as possible. And that's completely contrary to sustainable ideas. It's completely contrary to on-demand manufacturing, because it isn't about how cheap can you make it. It's about how can I make it right. And so one of the biggest challenges we have is breaking those behaviors. And we're seeing it. We're starting to see it. And this pandemic, if there's an upside to it, it really kind of woke everybody up that we have to change the way we're thinking about that. So we can change that.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, and what about the tech issues? I mean, are you saying that there are no tech issues and it's just behavior?
Oh, there's plenty of tech issues. I mean, but there's also existing tech out there that hasn't been utilized. And what's been really amazing is Zoom that we're on right now. That's been out there for quite a while, but all of a sudden we're using it now because we have to. And the technology in the apparel side, the virtual sampling and to be able to do designs without having to, be face-to-face, that technology exists. It's more about implementing it. We're seeing some of the challenges because we're trying to network together all of these factories is how do you actually connect them many to many? The whole world is in this one-to-many, brand orders from a factory. And so we're building this network that links them together, and we think that's an important piece. There's another piece that's really challenging right now from a technology point of view, and that's at the factories themselves, because we have to understand that for this to work, the factories have got to be able to live and prosper as well. And the factories are all successful because they want to fill their factory with giant runs and have high quantities. Whereas this on-demand world requires smaller runs and lots of different SKUs. And so what's missing for the factory is a whole bunch of optimization software about how do you actually manage all of those different small runs in an efficient way so that you can be on the supply side to the on-demand manufacturing. And so I think that's a big chunk that's missing. And then I talked about the AI, about how do you actually put a layer of thought, intelligence over all this to figure out how to optimize and figure out what the right factory to manufacture is out there. And that's another piece that we're having to build out because it just doesn't exist in the market right now. So there are some definite challenges from a technology point of view, but there's also behavioral challenges that are institutionalized in a lot of these older brands and retailers that need to be changed. And that's why we love working with companies like Ministry, because they don't have any of those old bad behaviors. Everything is new, and it's all about how do we do this better, faster, cheaper, and more sustainably. And that's a great place to be.
So for Kate and Aman, do you mind opining on what Kurt said? Is he full of hot air, or is he really on point there?
Well, I think first I have to address my old bad behaviors as a big corporate. So thank you for that, Kurt. But no, I think you're right. So I think it's a suite of technologies. It's a suite of things. It is absolutely behavior, but I think everything has made so much progress towards being able to do this efficiently and effectively, but it isn't necessarily 100% of the way there, right? So we need to have almost this perfect storm of fit technology being perfect, right? And how do we, if we're really going to be doing, made to measure in this on-demand manufacturing world, how do we make sure that it's really perfect? And one of the big challenges there is, you can train AI to measure a body, but you can't train AI to understand preference that a consumer may have, where you may be the same size in every measurement as someone else, but yet you like things a little tighter, they like them a little looser. So I think there's that whole preference thing in the fit tech specs that needs to still be optimized. I think a bigger piece of it is exactly what Kurt said about AI and better understanding that AI layer to help us be more predictive. The problem doesn't go away in terms of forecasting when you're closer to demand. While your forecasts are likely more accurate, you still have to have the raw materials there to make the product. So if you're, offering something customized, personalized, and you have a lot of different raw materials, you're still carrying a lot of different piece goods, to be able to make that if you're not forecasting well. So I think as that continues to evolve, I think that's also really what's going to be, some of that bench strength underneath the ability to do this effectively.
Aman, any last thoughts on that before I move to the next question?
No, I think Kate and Kurt covered it. I'd add two very small points. One is the other blocker for all of this is, a consumer's addiction to instant gratification, myself included. And Kurt alluded to this earlier with kind of a supply chain we've built with his team that almost replicates, in-stock supply chains. So we're getting there. But I do think that addiction to instant gratification isn't going anywhere. So we're better off just acknowledging it. And then in conjunction with that, the second thing I'd throw out is that this is the first time that kind of Moore's law principles apply to fashion really ever, to my knowledge, right? That this kind of pace that we're growing at, where 2 years ago, Kurt would have said on the same call, we can get a shirt out, we can get a sweater out in 2 weeks. Last year he would have said we can do it in a week, and just now he said we can do it in a day. And that pace of progress is stunning to watch as participant. We get to kind of be on the front line seeing this happen. So I do think that the system element of this will catch up with that addiction to instant gratification as a direct kind of product of Moore's law, that we'll see all this converge and continue to grow rapidly. So I don't think anything's stopping us. I think it's just.
So I'm going to weigh in with one comment there, and then we'll move on, which is I would actually push back on the instant gratification conversation, because as a consumer, and I'm sure you have been in the same predicament, all of you, is you place D2C orders with any of the essentials or non-essentials, and it's weeks before it gets there. And that's never been the case before. And I don't see a revolt or some sort of mass, kind of desertion of customer bases because you're now dealing with supply chains that are elongated. I think there's a patience and a sensitivity to, blockers and obstacles. And I would submit that if you gave the customer a choice of, hey, do you want the sustainable shirt in a week or 5 days versus the unsustainable shirt that's going to end up in a landfill in 2 days, I would love to see that test at some point. And I don't think brands are ready to do that yet, but I would really challenge you both to start testing your consumer base. Maybe you are, and I just don't know it. But that's the presumption is, oh, we can't possibly, take more time because the customer won't stand for it. And I would actually push back. It's what's the value of waiting? And, if you're getting custom made, you're happy to wait, right? In fact, sometimes that's a whole story in itself. So that would be my only opinion. Now I'm going to move to two last questions.
Pano, before you go on that, we think at Nimbly, we think that that's really important because that's part of the optimization of not optimizing just for price, is you can optimize for carbon footprint. When you can manufacture that same garment in 3 or 4 different factories, and then you know where the consumer is and you know how you're going to get it to them, you can think very differently about how you optimize. And then you can turn it to the consumer and say, hey, do you want this done in an eco factory and it's going to take 4 weeks to get there, or do you want it right away? And here's what that carbon footprint is. And I think the young generation that's coming up, the new consumer, is very woke on this, and they really want that. And I think that that's going to be the way forward. And maybe not the older generation, but I think the new consumers who are so concerned about climate change, that they're going to focus on that. And I think that we need to do that, and we have to be able to do it.
Okay, good. All right, 2 last questions. And these are very short answers, almost like yes, no. And each of you answer. The hardest product to get right, and then how far away in years are we as customers from an on-demand world being the norm and expected? Kurt, you want to start? Hardest product to get right?
I think some of the complex outerwear stuff and jackets are really, really hard to get right because there's just so many parts and pieces. Cool. And I think depending on the age of the consumer, it's a continuum of how far away they are. I think that the young consumers are very much focused on demand as an option and the sustainability part. And as you get a little bit older, it's going to take longer. So I don't think
that's a wishy-washy answer. 5, 10, or 20 years. Real simple.
Okay, 5. And I'll say
good.
5.
Thank you. Kate, hardest product to get right, and how far away are we?
Yeah, I think the easiest stuff, the most basic stuff, is the hardest stuff to really get right? Because if you're going to be spending money on a white shirt, you have a lot of options. So you want it to be the absolute perfect white shirt with that detail that's just spot on for you to be able to invest in that basic item. In terms of how, or rather when we think we're going to get there, I think I won't give a vague answer because you just called Kurt out, but I really want to. But I would say it depends on the category, right? So I think certain things people are going to want it on demand in 5 years. I think certain things it's going to take a little bit longer, not even because of the tech, but because there isn't as much of a purpose from the consumer standpoint to get it on demand.
All right, that's a big brand. Aman, come on, be like really forthright here and quick. Hardest product to get right. No, I'm just challenging a little bit. Okay, hardest product to get right, and how far away? 5, 10, or 20 years?
And I'm going to give you a 2 years. I think as long as this pandemic keeps up, that acceleration is so fast.
Awesome. Okay, thank you all. And I'm going to move this back to Halley for questions from the audience. Halley?
Thanks, Pano. Okay, Kate, the first one's for you. And of course, you can always choose not to answer. How does PVH handle the need to commit to buying cotton futures 12 to 18 months out so you get good pricing, quality to help margins? Or does PVH not buy futures and yarns so they can move to on demand?
Yeah, so I think we have different models for different purposes. I think the majority of our model, I'd say, is more that low and slow model where we are buying things further out in order to capture the right price point, just given sort of where we play in the market. But that said, we have an incredible supply base. We have amazing vendors who work with us on models that are more quick turn within their own base, where we look at how we can commit differently to materials on core items and how we can move differently there. So I think, we're moving more towards some of those faster models, which allow us to commit later. But really that has to be done with the amazing vendor base that we have in order for that to work.
Thanks, Kate. Kurt, this one's for you. How do you assure quality in an on-demand environment, i.e. material and finished product testing and inspections, QC, assuring social and environmental compliance on factories, making sure label claims are accurate and verified?
All the same ways that you do it in the non-on-demand world, which is you inspect the factories and you only work with good partners. You make sure that your raw materials are coming from verified sources. It actually is easier in our world because we know where every piece is manufactured. We can tell you where the raw materials came from. We can tell you what factory it was made in, all of those pieces. But you can't skimp on this stuff. You still have to have the inspections. You still have to have all of the partners in place that actually verify those factories and make sure. But it's some of that stuff, all that stuff exists. It's about applying it to the model.
Thanks, Kurt. Aman, perhaps you can answer this one. Do you view digital fabric printing tech, such as Cornet, providing meaningful value add to your on-demand fast turnaround manufacturing? If yes, are you planning to adopt digital fabric printing tech in your manufacturing process going forward?
Yeah, it's a really astute question. I suspect it's an industry insider that would have asked that, because fabric printing isn't a super common topic of discussion, but absolutely any form of late stage differentiation carries its weight in gold, and printing is certainly high on that list. So the ability to change a garment's entire aesthetic with what is often a waterless process is just incredible, and absolutely deserves a place in this conversation. So the short answer, yes, and we've already started doing it.
Thanks, Aman. This is for anyone. How do you think brands in the US can compete with leaders in on-demand manufacturing, such as Shein and Zara, that have integrated supply chains in their home country, which is difficult to replicate in the US? Or put another way, will manufacturing increase substantially domestically, or will the US never be able to compete on price of goods made offshore? It's for anyone.
Well, we're finding that we can, as far as Nimbly goes, that's exactly what the space that we're stepping into is. How do we actually do that? And how do we provide that for our customers? And I think there's a number of players that are coming up in the space to help enable brands to do that. And I don't think we're going to see, every factory coming back to the US, but a combination of new factories in the US plus the existing factories we have, stuff that can be done in Mexico or Central America, and then stuff, off in Asia. It's bringing together all of those parts and pieces and optimizing across all of them that allows you to do that. And I think that we can compete very well with Asia and low prices. And again, getting to what was said about pricing, it's about the value of what you're making. It's not about finding the cheapest, absolute lowest price you can make. It's about making stuff with good value that the consumer wants and they're willing to pay for it.
Thanks, Kurt. This one, I'll defer to you guys to decide who wants to take it. To meet JIT on-demand requirements from a manufacturing perspective, this is a supply chain issue, not just cut sew. How do you assure product inputs are available when needed?
Yeah, Haley, I'll just chime in. I think that kind of goes back to the conversation, the last question that I answered, which is, it's about better forecasting and better understanding exactly what inputs you're going to need based on trend. And it's about having an amazing, partnership with your mills, with your vendor base, with everyone else who's helping you sort of figure that out as you move through the chain. So it's definitely a challenge, but I think it's, some of the same components and some of the same technology issues that arise in the traditional model as well that have to be figured out.
Thank you. At this point, I'd love to kick it to Jay, who might have received some questions from the audience via email. Jay, any questions you want to address?
We did get a couple questions. Thanks, Halley. I think for Kate, this one is for you. If you think about PVH's lead times right now, where do they stand today in terms of weeks or months, and then 5 years from now, where do you think they'll be?
Yeah, so it differs, right? My nice vague answer there, but it differs. It depends on category, depends on raw material. But I think in general, we're always trying to make them closer to market. But I think it has to do with the type of product. So bigger commodity products or commodity categories where there's less differentiation on a season by season basis, and the demand and the trend is pretty clear. it makes sense for us to be able to stage early because it's a great benefit for us from a cost perspective for our vendors to be able to pre-plan capacity. So it makes sense. And then there's a balance to some of the higher fashion, I'd say, for lack of a better word, categories or items where, we want to be a little bit more nimble and be able to do that. So it's category, it's brand. We own some brands that are, more in the moderate national chain space that, maybe there's not as much need for that quick turn as some of our higher end brands or some of our more fashion forward brands. But I think it really is kind of balancing that mix.
Got it. And then this is a follow on to the same idea. If there was one obstacle you could remove to significantly lowering lead times, and you touched on this before when you talked about behaviors and things like that, but and Kurt touched on this too. What obstacle would you like to remove to be able to get your lead times down to a level significantly below where they are today?
Is that directed specifically at me? I'm happy to take it. So I would say that, I go back to, and I have to preface it with, I am still a planner at heart and spent my early career in planning, but I do think that one of the things that helps with that is planning. You can level load your factories better. You can start to think through, capacity from a different lens and understand demand better as you start to plan a little bit better ahead of time. So I think, all of the things that are happening in the space around machine learning, AI, big data, analytics is really going to help us to be able to be faster, because part of the reason we're often slow is because, of indecisiveness or because of waiting for a signal that we may not, get at the time we want to make a decision. So I think that that's going to be a big piece of helping us figure that out, beyond obviously all of the standard, technology needs and things that need to happen in the space for us to be able to execute against it.
Got it. Okay. And then Kurt, one for you. Somebody's asking, what percentage of your process, I think they're just looking for clarification, what percent of your process do you think, or the overall manufacturing process can be 100% automated at some point in the relative future? Because it sounds like if you're, when jobs get bigger and runs get bigger and you're using, different countries to source goods, it sounds like that becomes more of a manual process. Do you see a time where things become 100% automated?
Well, it depends if you're talking about the manufacture of clothing itself. With the manufacturing of clothing, for some garments, like some of the things that we make for ministry, it's 99% automated on a whole garment machine, and all we're doing is having it, laundering it and putting a tag in it. With some cut and sew processes, it's a lot of manual work, but there's technology companies that are out there working now to try to automate a lot of that, to take out the labor as much as they can. But some of it is just always going to have a little bit of a labor content, as long as we're going to still be making things with yarn and cloth and sewing it together or knitting it. There is going to be a little bit of labor content, but we're finding in the knitwear side that we can take a lot of the labor out of it because it's driven by a computer. And, like I said, whole garment is 99%. In the fully fashion where you're knitting pieces and then linking them together, it's probably 70% automated.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Halley, back to you.
Thank you. We have two more questions for people who want to stay on. I think they're good ones. For the group, what quantifiable KPIs are you able to use to shift the mindset on the P&L review of on-demand manufacturing compared to mainline from a margin IMU and typical merchant P&L mindset? It's interesting. I'll let anyone grab it.
Well, I think the biggest KPI is looking at total margin and of a set of products. The challenge with the IMU is I want to get it really cheap, and I'm going to sell it, but I'm going to buy a whole bunch of it, sell half of it at full price, sell a quarter of it at half price, and then throw away a quarter of it. Whereas if you do it on demand, you're not throwing away anything, and you're making all the pieces that you need. And then the KPI really is about the total margin profit of that product, because that's the only thing that really matters.
Thanks.
Just to piggyback on that, Kurt, I totally agree with that from a kind of standard P&L standpoint. And I'd add that I think one metric that we need to spend more time looking at, as it not just relates to our experience, but our product, is our consumer lifetime value. And I think if we're offering these new ways of engaging, we're offering these new models to our consumer, we have to understand how does that benefit the overall ecosystem of our brand for that consumer? And how do we start to measure that and quantify that versus, the one-time purchase or the one-time engagement with a particular product or experience?
Thanks both. Great answers. Final question. How are retailers and suppliers sharing the risk of on-demand manufacturing? With more on-demand, the supplier is carrying more inventory as opposed to the retailer carrying finished goods.
That's a tough one because nobody wants risk. I mean, that's what everybody's dying from because of COVID is people that had lots of inventory that they just got crushed. So there's this incredible push to be able to pre-position raw materials. And the only way it works is if there's a balance between the supplier and the brand or the retailer where they share that risk equally. It can't just be pushed onto the supplier. It has to be shared, otherwise it just doesn't work. And that's what I think the really progressive companies are doing is starting to think about what do I need to pre-position, what is the cost that, and how do I share that cost or at least cover that cost so the supplier doesn't get killed. You have to also remember that in most cases, these factories that are being used are not as well capitalized at all as the brands and retailers. And so putting any stress on them makes it very hard for them to survive. So you have to be very careful about asking them to do things that they can't do from a financial point of view.
Thanks, Kurt. Thank you, UBS, for your valued partnership on this event. Thank you to our guest speakers and to all of our listeners who dialed in. If you'd like to learn more about Xrc Labs, please reach out. If we didn't get to your question, please reach out. We look forward to the next event and have a great day, everyone. Thanks.